In the early hours of October 3rd, 1986, long before sunrise reached the ridgelines of western North Carolina, 13 men were already marked for death, even though none of them knew it yet. The Appalachian Mountains were quiet that night, in the way they only get when trouble is close. No wind, no insects, just the distant sound of water moving through creek beds and the occasional crack of wood settling in old cabins scattered through the hollers. This was Madison County, a place where roads ended without warning, where radios lost signal, and where people trusted family before law, memory before paperwork. By dawn, search dogs would be pacing in circles, helicopters would churn fog into mist, and deputies would be standing in clearings, staring at scenes they couldn't immediately explain. But at 1:17 a.m., none of that had happened yet. At that moment, a single Ford pickup rolled slowly up an unpaved logging road, its headlights off, engine idling just above a whisper. Inside were three men who had grown up hunting these hills, men who knew which branches snapped loudest, which trails washed out after rain, which places swallowed sound whole. They weren't police. They weren't criminals in the way newspapers would later describe. They were locals, and they were starting something that could not be stopped once it began. The reason traced back 3 days earlier, to a rusted tobacco barn outside the town of Hot Springs, where a deal collapsed the way bad deals always do, fast and final. What had been supposed to be a simple exchange, cash for product, no names, no witnesses, ended with one man bleeding out on packed dirt while everyone else ran. The body was found at sunrise by a farmer checking his fence line, a single gunshot wound to the chest. No wallet, no weapon, no explanation. The sheriff ruled it a homicide, but there were no leads, no cameras, no cooperation. Everyone in the county knew who had been there that night, and everyone knew the law wouldn't touch it. That silence was the trigger. By the second night, trucks were moving after dark. Conversations stopped when strangers entered rooms, and men who hadn't spoken in years started checking rifles like they were going hunting before season. By the third night, lists existed, not written down, but shared in murmured confirmations and long looks. 13 names. 13 men who had been at the barn, who had run instead of helping, who had taken something that didn't belong to them and left one of their own to die alone. No meetings were held. No votes were taken. The mountains didn't require consensus. At 1:23 a.m., the pickup stopped near an old fire road, tires crunching softly on gravel. Doors opened and closed without slamming. Somewhere deeper in the woods, another engine cut off in response, then another. The manhunt had begun. Not loud, not chaotic, but methodical, shaped by terrain and resentment, and the shared understanding that once the sun came up, it would already be too late for anyone to stop what the night had set in motion. By 1:40 a.m., the mountains were no longer quiet. They were listening. Madison County's back roads funneled movement the way rivers funnel water, forcing anyone trying to leave into predictable paths, and the men running the manhunt knew that better than any map ever printed. The first target never heard them coming. He was holed up in a single-wide trailer tucked against a slope near Shelton Laurel, generator humming softly behind it, television flickering blue light through a cracked window. He'd been at the barn 3 nights earlier, had taken cash meant for someone else, and had driven away when things went wrong. At 1:46 a.m., the generator died, a single clean cut to the fuel line. 30 seconds later, the door came open. There was shouting, a confused voice asking what was going on, then one sharp crack that echoed once and vanished into the trees. the men didn't linger. By the time the body hit the floor, headlights were already moving elsewhere, splitting and rejoining like predators circling prey. The second and third men tried to run. They bolted from a hunting cabin when dogs started barking, sprinting downhill through wet leaves and laurel thickets, breath tearing out of their chests, convinced distance would save them. It didn't. Shots came from above and from the side, controlled, deliberate, forcing them into open ground where there was nowhere left to go. By 2:20 a.m., both were down in a creek bed, water carrying blood downstream toward farms that would wake up to helicopters hours later. Word spread fast, not through phones, but through absence. A man didn't show up where he was expected. A porch light stayed on too long. A truck sat abandoned with the keys still in the ignition. Fear did what law enforcement couldn't, flushing people out of hiding. 2 of the 13 turned themselves into ghosts, abandoning homes, leaving behind families who would later swear they heard engines in the distance all night, circling, waiting. Others tried to band together, thinking numbers meant safety. They were wrong. At an old deer camp above the French Broad River, 4 men armed themselves and waited, convinced they could ride out the night. At 3:07 a.m., rifle fire shattered the windows, punching through rotting wood and cheap insulation. The exchange lasted less than a minute. When it ended, 3 were dead inside. 1 crawled into the woods bleeding, found just before dawn, less than a mile away, collapsed against a tree like he'd finally accepted the inevitable. By 4:30 a.m., fog rolled heavy into the valleys, swallowing tracks, muting sound, helping erase the mechanics of what was happening. Deputies later said it felt like the mountains themselves were involved, hiding things on purpose. By sunrise, 13 men were missing or dead, spread across miles of terrain no outsider could have navigated in daylight, let alone in darkness. When the first 911 call finally went through at 6:12 a.m., the voice on the other end didn't ask for help. It only said, "They're all gone," and hung up. By mid-morning, Madison County no longer belonged to itself. Sheriff's deputies stood at roadblocks they hadn't planned for, rerouting locals away from areas they couldn't yet explain, while state troopers arrived piecemeal, trying to assemble a picture from fragments that refused to line up. 13 scenes, no clear order, no obvious suspects, and almost no witnesses willing to speak. Every location told the same story without saying it out loud. The men who died hadn't been ambushed randomly. They'd been selected. Each body lay where someone had clearly been expected to be: a trailer, a cabin, a known camp, a route home. This wasn't rage spilling over. It was follow-through. By noon, the rumor mill was running faster than official channels, and everyone knew the same thing in different words. The men who died were the ones who ran from the barn, the ones who left someone to bleed out alone. The state police called it coordinated homicide. The locals didn't call it anything at all. They just nodded and avoided eye contact. When investigators canvassed homes, they got the same answers repeated with minor variations. Didn't hear nothing. Was asleep. Didn't see a thing. Don't know those men that well. Cell phone records showed gaps where towers should have logged movement. Radios went silent in overlapping windows, and tire impressions disappeared where fog and frost had done their work. By the second day, the narrative hardened. 13 men hunted through the hills by people who never intended to be caught. Helicopters circled, dogs tracked and lost trails. Agents walked miles of forest that looked untouched, as if the night had never happened. But the most unsettling part wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't. No shell casings in several locations. No dropped equipment. No panicked mistakes. Whoever planned it had cleaned as they went, or never left much behind in the first place. Families of the dead demanded arrests, answers, names, but there were none to give. The barn was processed, but too late. Rain had washed away blood, footprints, everything except the fact that someone had died there and been abandoned. That detail came up again and again in private conversations deputies overheard, the word abandoned carrying more weight than murder. By the end of the week, the manhunt officially shifted direction, from searching for killers to preventing retaliation, but nothing happened. No reprisals, no follow-up violence. Just a sudden, unnatural calm, as if the county had exhaled all at once. People returned to routines, but something fundamental had changed. Men who'd once driven those roads at night stopped doing so. Conversations ended faster. Doors stayed locked. In quiet moments, the same question surfaced again and again. Not spoken, publicly, only between people who trusted each other enough to admit it. If the law couldn't or wouldn't act, and the mountains had, what exactly was anyone supposed to do next? The answer came slowly, in ways that never made it into official reports. Over the following weeks, investigators identified patterns they couldn't prosecute: overlapping family ties, shared hunting leases, old feuds that predated the barn incident by years, all pointing toward a loose coalition of men who had grown up together and drifted apart, only to reunite when the rules they lived by were violated. But without confessions, without physical evidence that tied a specific weapon to a specific shooter, there was nothing to charge. A grand jury was convened in Asheville in November, and it collapsed quietly after 3 days of testimony that went nowhere. Witnesses forgot details, timelines blurred. One man recanted entirely, claiming fear and confusion. Another disappeared before he could be subpoenaed, later resurfacing in Tennessee with no explanation for the missing weeks. By winter, the case was effectively cold, though nobody in Madison County ever used that word. They knew better. Cold cases implied mystery. This wasn't mysterious, it was understood. The barn was torn down by its owner before Christmas. The boards burned in a controlled fire under the excuse of safety hazards. Families of the 13 dead began leaving the county one by one. Trailers sold cheap or abandoned. Children pulled from schools without warning. Those who stayed learned quickly which questions not to ask and which roads not to drive after dark. In private, some admitted the truth they'd never say aloud, that the manhunt hadn't been about revenge alone, but about drawing a line so clear it wouldn't need to be enforced again. And it worked. For years afterward, deals were honored with an almost religious seriousness. People showed up when they were supposed to. No one ran when things went wrong. Law enforcement noticed the change but couldn't explain it. A sudden drop in certain crimes paired with a deepening silence they couldn't penetrate. The families who lost sons and brothers carried their grief like a permanent injury. Anger mixed with the knowledge that pursuing justice might cost them what little safety remained. Every anniversary of that October night passed without ceremony. No memorials, no news segments. Just the mountains doing what they'd always done, absorbing everything and giving nothing back. Years later, a retired deputy would say off the record that the most frightening part wasn't the violence, but how final it felt, how cleanly the county closed around it and moved on. 13 men hunted through the hills. No arrests, no trials, no closure, only a lesson etched into the collective memory of the place. In Madison County, after 1986, everyone understood the same thing without ever needing it explained. There were laws written on paper, and there, were laws written into the land, and confusing the two had consequences that even time couldn't undo. Years later, when outsiders tried to reconstruct what happened that night, they always focused on the violence and missed the aftermath, which was quieter and more instructive. Madison County entered a kind of suspended state, not lawless, but recalibrated. Sheriffs still patrolled, courts still met, taxes were still paid, but the social fabric had shifted in a way no statute could address. Men who had once taken risks because they believed chaos protected them stopped doing so. Deals were no longer casual, they were binding. If someone said they would show up, they did. If something went wrong, they stayed until it was resolved. The idea of running, of leaving another man to take the fall alone, vanished almost overnight. Teachers noticed it first. Fewer fights, less posturing. Boys who had grown up watching older men test boundaries suddenly acted like boundaries were immovable. Mothers noticed it too. The way trucks slowed when passing homes. The way strangers announced themselves before stepping onto porches. Even the local economy felt the change. Cash jobs became cleaner. Middlemen disappeared. Everyone knew that whatever had enforced the new order was not something anyone wanted to wake again. Law enforcement never named suspects, but they quietly reassigned deputies who had grown up in the county, moving them elsewhere, rotating faces, trying to dilute a shared understanding they could sense but not prove. It didn't work. The knowledge wasn't held by individuals, it was held by the place itself. In 1992, when a similar incident threatened to unfold over a logging contract dispute, it ended before it began. The men involved met at a diner in daylight, settled accounts, shook hands, and walked away. One of them later told a reporter, off record, that nobody wanted another October. The families of the 13 carried on in different ways. Some left Appalachia entirely, changing names, starting over in cities where the hills couldn't follow them. Others stayed, anchored by land they couldn't abandon even if they wanted to. They lived with a particular kind of grief, not just for the men they lost, but for the knowledge that everyone around them understood why it had happened, even if no one would ever say it to their faces. No trials meant no official villains. No sentences meant no formal justice, only a permanent absence that shaped everything afterward. By the late 1990s, younger residents knew the story only in fragments, warnings wrapped in vague phrases, "Don't run, don't lie, don't leave a man behind." They didn't always know where the rules came from, only that breaking them led somewhere final. Madison County never built a monument, never marked the sites, never acknowledged the manhunt publicly. It didn't need to. The hills remembered. And in a place where memory carries farther than sound, that was enough to ensure that what happened in 1986 never happened again. Not because the law finally arrived, but because the cost of crossing the wrong line had been made unmistakably clear. In the end, what made the Appalachian Manhunt of North Carolina 1986 endure wasn't the body count or the mystery, but the absence of resolution. No courtroom ever assigned guilt. No headline ever declared justice served. The state closed its file quietly in 1988, citing lack of prosecutable evidence, and with that, the official version of events stopped evolving. But the unofficial version continued to shape behavior for decades. Men who had been young then aged into positions of quiet authority. Landowners, employers, fathers. The kind of people others watched before making decisions. They never spoke about that night. Not directly, but they didn't need to. The rules were already written into how they lived. When disputes arose, they were handled early and in daylight. When tempers flared, someone stepped, and before pride could harden into something dangerous. The idea that you could disappear into the mountains and outrun consequences died with those 13 men. Outsiders who moved into the county sometimes sensed it, an underlying caution in conversations, a seriousness about promises that felt old-fashioned and unspoken. Those who ignored it rarely stayed long. Every few years, a journalist would try to revive the story, chasing rumors, asking the same questions, hoping time had loosened tongues. It never did. People listened politely, then changed the subject, or offered versions so stripped of detail they were useless. What happened belonged to the mountains now, and the mountains don't testify. For the families of the dead, closure never came. Birthdays passed. Grandchildren were born who never knew the men whose names they carried. Grief settled into something quieter, a permanent weight instead of an open wound. For everyone else, the manhunt became a boundary marker, a reminder that when systems fail and trust breaks completely, order doesn't vanish, it mutates. It becomes something colder, something final. Years later, a former state investigator summed it up in a single sentence that never made it into any report. It wasn't about killing 13 men. It was about making sure nobody ever ran again. Whether that lesson prevented future bloodshed or merely buried it deeper is impossible to know. What is certain is that in those hills, on one October night, the law lost control and never fully took it back. The land absorbed the violence, the people absorbed the lesson, and the silence that followed proved more powerful than any sentence a court could have handed down. What remains hardest to explain to anyone who didn't grow up there is how quickly the story stopped being about the dead and became about the living. By the early 2000s, Madison County had changed hands without anyone noticing. Old men who remembered the night firsthand were gone or quiet, replaced by people who only knew the rules, not the origin. They obeyed them without understanding why, the way you obey gravity without questioning it. Hunters still walked those ridges every fall, stepping over places where nothing visible marked what had happened, but where everyone instinctively lowered their voices. Land changed owners, cabins were rebuilt, logging roads washed out and recut, yet certain stretches stayed empty, avoided without explanation. When pressed, locals shrugged and said the ground was bad there, unstable, never mind that the soil looked no different from anywhere else. Law enforcement occasionally reopened the file for internal review, usually when a new sheriff wanted to prove diligence, but it never went anywhere. Evidence was gone, witnesses were older, and no one made mistakes anymore. The case became a reference point in training seminars, an example of how community silence could be more impenetrable than organized crime, because it wasn't enforced by fear of punishment, but by shared understanding. Sociologists would later describe it as collective deterrence, a system where enforcement was so absolute it never had to be repeated. But that language didn't capture the human cost. Children grew up knowing something terrible had happened without ever being told exactly what. Some sensed it in how their parents reacted to conflict, in the way arguments were shut down early, voices lowered, hands raised in calming gestures. Others learned it the hard way, by pushing too far and being warned once, quietly, by someone who didn't threaten but didn't have to. By then, the story had lost its names and dates, reduced to a single idea that hovered over everything. There are consequences you can't outpace. In interviews years later, people who had lived through it described a strange duality, shame mixed with relief, horror paired with the knowledge that the violence had ended something worse before it could grow. Whether that belief was true or just a way to live with what happened didn't matter anymore. The mountains didn't care. They had taken 13 men and returned a kind of order that no court ever could. And that is why the Appalachian Manhunt of North Carolina, 1986, never really ended. It simply settled into the land, into behavior, into silence, waiting as a reminder of what happens when trust collapses and the law arrives too late to matter. By the time the state officially archived the case, the phrase Appalachian Manhunt had already become something people avoided saying out loud, not because it wasn't true, but because naming it felt like inviting it back. Older residents would later say that the real aftermath wasn't fear, but restraint, a learned instinct to stop before crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Men who might have once tested each other chose distance instead. Arguments cooled faster. Pride bent where it once would have snapped. The mountains, unchanged and indifferent, continued to draw tourists every fall, hikers chasing views and colors, never realizing how close their trails ran to places where 13 lives had ended without ceremony. Occasionally, someone would stumble onto an old shell fragment or a collapsed fire ring deep in the woods, call it in, and watch deputies arrive only to quietly bag it and say nothing more. No press releases followed, no updates. Just another piece of the night swallowed back into the ground. In 2006, a Forest Service crew widening a trail uncovered human remains, believed to belong to one of the 13 who had never been officially recovered. The bones were identified, returned to family, and buried without headlines. When asked if the discovery changed anything, a county official answered honestly for once, no. Nothing to investigate, nothing to reopen, nothing to fix. The system had already decided years earlier that whatever justice looked like here, it wasn't coming from a courtroom. And that may be the most disturbing legacy of all, not that 13 men were hunted through the hills, but that everyone involved, witnesses, authorities, neighbors, quietly accepted the outcome as final. The law didn't fail loudly. It simply stepped aside, and something older took its place. Whether that something prevented future bloodshed or only postponed it is impossible to measure, because deterrence leaves no statistics, only absences. What is certain is that the night of October 3, 1986, drew a boundary no one has tested since. The mountains still stand. The roads still end without warning. And Madison County still lives with the knowledge that when trust collapses completely, order doesn't disappear. It becomes absolute, enforced not by badges or courts, but by the understanding that some mistakes don't come with second chances, only silence afterward. What few people outside the county ever grasped was how narrowly the manhunt avoided becoming something even larger, because on that same night, there were at least 2 moments where it almost spiraled beyond control. Later interviews, conducted decades after the fact, with individuals who spoke only once they were old enough to believe consequences no longer mattered, revealed that not all 13 targets were originally on the list. There were names debated quietly in the days before the barn incident, men who had been loosely connected, men whose guilt was circumstantial rather than direct. In the end, restraint prevailed, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Those involved understood that precision mattered more than volume, that the message would only hold if it was unmistakably tied to a specific act, a specific betrayal. That decision likely kept the county from descending into cycles of retaliation that would have torn it apart entirely. Even so, the psychological damage ran deep. Children who grew up in the shadow of that October night absorbed the tension without context, sensing that adults reacted to conflict with a seriousness that felt disproportionate to whatever argument was happening. Teachers learned to intervene early. Pastors avoided sermons about justice that might reopen wounds, and local officials became experts at redirecting attention whenever the subject came up. The silence wasn't imposed by threat, but by fatigue, by the understanding that digging into the past wouldn't restore anything that had been lost. Over time, the manhunt stopped being remembered as an event and started functioning as a boundary condition, a silent reference point for behavior. When people asked why Madison County seemed calmer than similar rural areas struggling with the same economic pressures, longtime residents would give vague answers about community values or knowing your neighbors, never mentioning the night that had burned those values into place. The truth was more uncomfortable. Order had been purchased at an unpayable cost, and everyone was living off the interest. As years passed, the men who had coordinated the hunt aged into obscurity, some dying quietly, others moving away, none ever facing formal judgment. That absence of accountability became part of the story too, raising questions no one wanted to answer about legitimacy, morality, and whether justice without law could ever truly be called justice at all. Yet despite those questions, the effect remained. No similar incident ever occurred again in that county. Deals were honored, conflicts de-escalated, people remembered, even if they pretended not to. And in a region where memory travels through behavior rather than words, that was enough. The Appalachian Manhunt of North Carolina, 1986, didn't end with arrests or trials or headlines declaring closure. It ended by rewriting the invisible rules people lived by, embedding them so deeply into daily life that challenging them felt unthinkable. Long after the bodies were buried and the files were closed, the hills continued to enforce what the law never could, not through violence, but through the shared understanding of what had already happened once and what would never be allowed to happen again. By the time the story faded completely from public awareness, replaced by newer crimes and louder scandals, Madison County had already absorbed it into something permanent. What happened in 1986 was no longer referenced as a warning. It was assumed as a constant, like weather patterns or terrain. People didn't say, "Remember what happened." They behaved as if remembering was automatic. When young men reached an age where bravado usually peaks, older relatives steered them quietly, not with threats, but with a look that carried history they didn't bother explaining. Outsiders sometimes mistook this restraint for passivity, for weakness, not understanding that it was the opposite. It was discipline learned the hardest possible way. In 2014, a regional university attempted a sociological study on informal justice systems in rural Appalachia and requested interviews in Madison County. The project was abandoned within weeks. Participation was almost non-existent. Consent forms left unsigned, calls unanswered. One professor later admitted they'd underestimated how deeply the community guarded certain knowledge, not out of conspiracy, but out of collective instinct. Some things were not to be externalized. The mountains, after all, had already borne witness. In private moments, a few aging residents admitted the weight never fully lifted. Sleep came harder after arguments. Stormy nights carried echoes that didn't belong to thunder. But they also admitted something else, something harder to say without sounding monstrous, that the night prevented worse futures, that without it, violence would have escalated slowly, unpredictably, dragging families into endless feuds the way it had generations before. This wasn't justification so much as survival logic, a way to make sense of living in a place where institutional help had always arrived late or not at all. Whether that logic holds up under moral scrutiny doesn't change the outcome. 13 men were hunted, and no one ever tried it again. The lesson was absorbed not because it was right, but because it was final. And that is the uncomfortable truth at the core of the Appalachian Manhunt of North Carolina, 1986. It worked. Not in a way anyone would endorse publicly, not in a way that could ever be defended in court, but in the only way that mattered to the people who lived there. The hills remained quiet afterward, not because peace had been achieved, but because everyone understood the cost of breaking it. What ultimately sealed the story into legend rather than case law was how completely it resisted being reduced to individuals. There was no single mastermind to point to, no charismatic leader whose arrest could symbolize accountability. Responsibility was diffuse by design, spread across relationships, terrain, and timing in a way that mirrored how people there already lived. The mountains didn't produce lone actors. They produced networks, quiet alignments formed long before anyone realized they existed. Investigators who came later with fresh eyes always stumbled on the same obstacle. Nothing illegal connected anyone until the moment it was too late to matter. No planning calls, no meetings that could be proven, no written lists. The manhunt had been assembled out of shared knowledge and unspoken agreement, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. Over time, that realization changed how authorities approached rural cases elsewhere. But Madison County remained an outlier, an example that didn't quite fit training manuals. In interviews years later, some residents described the aftermath as living with a closed fist inside your chest. Not clenched in anger, but in readiness. A permanent awareness that lines existed, whether or not they were written down. Children learned those lines without being taught. They watched how adults reacted when trust was tested, how voices dropped instead of rising, how problems were contained before they metastasized. The dead were remembered privately, mourned without spectacle, while the living adjusted their behavior to ensure no one ever added to that list again. That adjustment became tradition. By the 2010s, new residents moving into the county often commented on how calm disputes felt compared to other places struggling with the same economic pressures. They attributed it to community spirit or small-town values, never realizing those values had been reinforced by a single night that recalibrated everyone's understanding of consequence. The Appalachian Manhunt of North Carolina, 1986, never produced a verdict, but it produced compliance, and in that sense, it achieved what courts could not. That achievement is precisely what makes it so unsettling. It suggests that order can exist without justice, that peace can be maintained through memory rather than law, and that communities can adapt in ways that defy outside judgment. Whether that adaptation represents resilience or moral failure depends entirely on where you stand. For Madison County, the question stopped being theoretical a long time ago. The hills had already answered it, and the people who lived among them learned to listen. In the final accounting, the Appalachian Manhunt of North Carolina, 1986, left behind no heroes, no villains that could be neatly named, and no lesson that fit comfortably into headlines or textbooks. It left only a boundary, invisible but absolute, drawn through a community that learned what happens when trust collapses completely. For the rest of the state, and for anyone who later tried to understand it from the outside, the story remained frustratingly incomplete, a chain of events without a satisfying conclusion. But for the people who lived there, the conclusion was obvious the moment the sun rose. After that night, 13 men were gone, and the world did not end. Instead, it narrowed. choices became fewer. Consequences became clearer. The idea that someone could walk away from responsibility without paying for it died in those hills, replaced by a quieter, harsher understanding of accountability. Over time, even the emotional charge faded. What remained was behavioral, a reflex. Problems were handled early. Conflicts were contained. Running was no longer an option anyone seriously considered. The law eventually rebuilt its presence, better funding, better response times, more oversight, but it never fully reclaimed the authority it had lost that night. People complied with it, respected it even, but they no longer believed it was the final backstop. That role belonged to memory, and memory, unlike institutions, did not forget or forgive. Today, if you drive those roads, nothing marks what happened. No signs, no memorials. Just trees, hills, and quiet towns that look like countless others across Appalachia. But the calm is deceptive. It is not innocence. It is experience. It is a place that learned, in the most brutal way possible, how fragile order really is and how quickly it can be replaced by something colder when systems fail. The Appalachian Manhunt of North Carolina 1986 did not resolve injustice or restore what was lost. It simply ended a chapter and closed the book so firmly that no one has dared to reopen it since. And that is why, decades later, the story still matters, not as a spectacle of violence, but as a reminder that when law arrives too late, communities will write their own endings, and those endings are rarely merciful, rarely fair, but always final. There was nothing left to add after that, and that was the point. No final twist, no hidden arrest years later, no confession pulled from a deathbed. The Appalachian Manhunt of North Carolina 1986 ended exactly where it began, in silence, held together by memory rather than record. For outsiders, that made it unsatisfying, a story without payoff. For the people who lived there, it was complete. 13 men died, a line was drawn, and life reorganized itself around the knowledge of that cost. The mountains didn't glorify it, didn't condemn it, didn't explain it. They absorbed it and moved on the way they always have. And in a place where land outlasts law, where memory carries farther than sound, that was enough.